My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 64 years old, and I raised a son not born to me on 40 years of diner shifts and a promise made to his dying father. Have you ever been erased from your own family? At a dinner in Manhattan, his fiancée Chloe's mother smiled at the table and said, "This is Daniel's nanny, so devoted, all these years." I understood exactly what that sentence was doing. It was designed to remove me from that room, from Daniel's life, from the word mother itself. To make 24 years disappear as though they had never existed. I set my fork down. I am his mother. Her smile didn't move. That was the frightening part. It wasn't a contradiction. It was dismissal. I knew, sitting at that table, that the fight had already begun. Days later, a bank teller slid a document toward me. "There's a power of attorney on file. Temporary management authority. For Ms. Sterling. I never signed this. You'll want to speak with our fraud department." Her voice dropped when she said it. Fraud. That meant what happened to my account was not a mistake. Someone had deliberately used my name. That was the word a 64-year-old woman heard when she walked into a bank to protect the money she had spent a lifetime building. I called my son Daniel. 24 years I raised him. Every double shift. Every skipped vacation. Every tuition payment. His mother needed him to understand what was happening. $50,000 gone. Daniel. My name was forged. And tonight there's a document on my kitchen table. A reverse mortgage. Do you know what that is? You borrow against your home, and the moment you're gone, the house goes with it. My apartment. The one I paid off so you'd never have to worry about me. Chloe's note says, "For your security and Daniel's future. I want to ask you something. If you were standing where I was standing, your life savings gone, your home being taken, and your child silent on the other end of the line, what would you have done?" I picked up the pen. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. I opened the kitchen drawer. There was a drawing inside. Crayon on construction paper, the edges soft with age. Two figures standing side by side. At the bottom, in the crooked capital letters of an 8-year-old boy, my mom and me. That was when I understood. It was never the money. It was never the apartment. What they were trying to take was the 24 years this boy had called me his mother. The fact of what I was to him. And that was the one thing I could not put down. I put the pen down. They chose the wrong mother to erase. The smell of rendered fat and caramelized onions had a way of making a small apartment feel like something larger than itself. Margaret Holloway understood this. She had understood it for most of her 64 years. The way certain smells could expand the walls of a place, could turn a cramped queen's kitchen with its chipped linoleum and the water stain shaped like the state of Florida above the window into something that felt, if only briefly, like abundance. She had started the brisket at 11 that morning. Low heat, the way her mother had taught her, the way she had taught herself not to rush the things that mattered. 3 pounds of flat-cut beef, a can of crushed tomatoes, a whole head of garlic broken apart and scattered like small promises across the bottom of the Dutch oven. 2 onions, sliced thin, laid over the top like a blanket. The lid set with care. The timer ignored entirely, because a brisket cooked by a timer never tasted right. You had to smell it. You had to know. It was a Thursday in late October. Outside, the elevated tracks of the 7 train cut across the gray afternoon sky, and every few minutes the apartment shuddered lightly as a train passed. Margaret had lived here for 22 years. She no longer noticed the shuddering. What she noticed was the silence between the trains, the way it settled around her like something she had learned to wear. She had set the table that morning too, before starting the brisket. 2 plates, the good ceramic ones with the blue rim, not the chipped everyday set she used for herself on the other 364 days of the year. A cloth napkin she had ironed, because Daniel noticed things like that even when he pretended not to. A small glass vase with 3 carnations she had picked up from the Korean grocery. 2 blocks over white ones, because they were $2 and because she liked the way they looked against the blue rim of the plates. Daniel was coming at 4. By 4:15, he had not arrived. Margaret did not check her phone obsessively. That was not her way. She moved around the kitchen with the particular economy of a woman who had spent decades on her feet in commercial spaces: the diner counter, the breakfast rush, the long Saturday brunches that left her lower back aching well into Sunday morning. She wiped down the stovetop she had already wiped. She adjusted the carnations in the vase by approximately nothing. She had paid for his undergraduate tuition with those years on her feet. Organic chemistry textbooks, MCAT prep courses, the deposit on the apartment near Columbia when he started medical school. The one with the broken radiator they had laughed about together in the November cold, eating takeout on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. She had never once presented him with an accounting of these things. He was her son. Her late husband Joe had been Daniel's father in every way that counted and in no way that was biological. Joe had come into both their lives when Daniel was 7, and the paperwork had made it official 2 years later, but the reality of it, the weight and the texture of it, had been established the first winter, when Daniel got the stomach flu and Joe sat on the bathroom floor with him for 4 hours without being asked. That was the kind of father Joe had been. And when Joe died, 11 years ago now, he had left Margaret a small life insurance policy and a son, and the clear expectation that she would not fail either of them. She had not failed them. At 4:30, she heard the key in the lock. Daniel came in carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for longer than his body wanted to remember. He was 31 now, tall in the way that still surprised her sometimes, with Joe's wide forehead and his own mother's dark eyes, his birth mother. The woman who had walked away when Daniel was 6, the woman Margaret had replaced not by trying but by staying. His white coat was gone, replaced by a gray fleece that had seen better years. And his phone was already in his hand when he came through the door, screen lit, buzzing against his palm. "Hey, Mom." He kissed her cheek, distracted. His eyes dropped briefly to the phone before he caught himself and slid it into his pocket. "Coat," she said. He smiled, a real one, briefly, and hung his coat on the hook by the door. An old habit. She had built him in small habits like this, years of small habits, until they became the architecture of who he was. "Smells incredible," he said. "You didn't have to do all this. Sit down." She brought the brisket to the table in the Dutch oven, setting it on the trivet she'd had since the Clinton administration. She served him a plate the way she always had, the larger portion, the better cut, the piece with the most caramelized edge. He accepted it the way he always had, without protest, because some rituals ran deeper than manners. They talked. He told her about about a patient he'd had that week. An 80-year-old man who had come in with chest pain and turned out to have been symptomatic for 2 days before his daughter convinced him to go in. He shook his head when he said it, the particular shake of a physician who has seen this pattern enough times to grieve it without surprise. Margaret listened the way she always listened, with her whole body, her fork resting on the edge of her plate. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it in his pocket. She could see the slight shift of his jaw, the fractional tightening. He left it. It buzzed again. "Go ahead," she said. "It's fine." "Daniel." He took it out, glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his face. Something she did not have a name for yet, though she felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. He typed a quick response. Screen tilted away from her at an angle that she noticed but did not remark upon, and set the phone face down on the table. "Wedding stuff?" she asked. Chloe had a question about the venue deposit. He picked up his fork again. "It's handled." The engagement had been announced 4 months ago. Margaret had met Chloe Sterling 3 times, once at a dinner in the West Village that had cost more than Margaret's weekly grocery budget. Once at a family gathering at the Sterling's townhouse in the East 70s where she had felt as precisely categorized as a museum exhibit, and once briefly in Daniel's hospital parking lot, where Chloe had worn sunglasses at 7 in the evening and not removed them. The sterlings were old money in the way that requires maintenance, constant, vigilant, expensive maintenance, and they had made it clear, in the way that people of that class made things clear, without ever saying them directly, that Margaret and her queen's apartment and her brisket and her scarred hands were a component of Daniel's history, that they were prepared to tolerate with grace. Margaret had said nothing about any of this to Daniel. She was his mother. She would wait and see. The phone buzzed again. This time, the screen lit upward and she caught the display before he turned it over. Private caller. Daniel answered it, his voice dropping as he half turned in his chair. Hey, yeah, he paused. Yeah, give me 1 second. He stood. I'm sorry, Mom, I just have to. He moved toward the hallway, his voice going lower, his back to her. She looked at her plate. The brisket was cooling. It always tasted better warm. She had cooked it for 6 hours. She heard fragments of phrase, half a laugh that didn't sound like his usual laugh, a lowered yes, and then he was back, phone away, sitting down with a smile that arrived a half second too late to be spontaneous. Sorry, everything's fine. Everything all right with the wedding plans? She asked. The same words she always used. The door she always left open. Absolutely, he said. And then, the brisket is seriously perfect, Mom. You don't forget anything, do you? She smiled at him across the table. She told herself he was tired. Shifts. The stress of planning a wedding to a woman whose family ran 3 holding companies and had opinions about floral arrangements that cost more than Margaret made in a month. She told herself these things with the practiced certainty of a woman who had been telling herself difficult things were fine for a long time. The brisket grew cold on the chipped ceramic plate. She watched him and she loved him and she told herself tired. Just tired. But a seed had been planted in the quiet of that October kitchen, small and dark, in the moment he turned his screen away from her. And seeds, Margaret knew, grow whether you tend them or not. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery store circular and a past due notice for a utility bill that Margaret had already paid online and was therefore not worried about. She almost missed it. The envelope was standard white, bank issue, with the logo of her credit union in the upper left corner, and her name printed in the slightly off font that automated systems used when they generated correspondence in bulk. She set it on the kitchen counter while she put away her coat and her bag and filled the kettle for tea. Then she picked it up. She read it standing at the counter, her tea unmade, the kettle beginning its low pre-boil murmur behind her. It was a notice regarding her 401k account. A withdrawal had been processed. $50,000, disbursed 12 days ago to an account she did not recognize. The letter thanked her for her continued membership and reminded her that early withdrawal penalties had been applied per federal guidelines and that if she had questions, she should call the number at the bottom during business hours. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly, the way she had learned to read documents after Joe died. And she'd had to navigate probate alone with a lawyer she'd found through the parish bulletin. She had not made this withdrawal. She had not authorized this withdrawal. She had not been contacted about this withdrawal. The $50,000 was the money she had been setting aside for 11 years, $100 here, $150 there. Sometimes nothing for months when the diner cut her hours, sometimes a small surge when she picked up catering shifts on weekends. It was the money she had named, privately, Daniel's wedding gift. Not because she had planned to give it all at once. She was practical enough to know that $50,000 given to a woman like Chloe Sterling would register as approximately nothing, but because she had wanted to have it. She had wanted to be the kind of mother who had it to give, who had built something from scratch over decades of early mornings and sore feet, who could place something real in her son's hands on the day he started his life. She put the letter in her coat pocket and took the bus to the bank. The branch was on Northern Boulevard, a low-ceilinged space that always smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and recycled air. She had been banking here for 19 years. The teller who saw her, a young woman named Priya whose name tag was slightly crooked, pulled up her account with the efficient neutrality of someone trained to deliver difficult information without editorializing. I see the withdrawal here, Priya said. October 14th. Processed through the associated power of attorney authorization on file. Margaret kept her hands flat on the counter. I don't have a power of attorney on file. Priya's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes adjusted slightly, a microshift of professional caution. I'm showing a POA document executed on October 9th. Would you like me to pull the record? Yes, Margaret said. Please. The document that appeared on the screen turned to face her with the slight angle of someone presenting information they would rather not present. Was 2 pages, densely typed, with Margaret's signature at the bottom of the second page. It designated one Chloe Renata Sterling as having temporary and limited management authority over Margaret's financial accounts for the purpose of coordinating wedding-related financial transactions. Margaret looked at her signature. She had not signed this document. She knew her own signature. She had been signing her name for 64 years. She knew the particular way the M opened up too wide, the way the H of Holloway compressed at the top. From the years she'd spent signing checks quickly at the end of double shifts. What was on this document was close, very close, but it was not hers. The M was wrong. The closure on the double L was wrong. I never signed this, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. The air-conditioned air of the bank lobby felt suddenly very cold against her neck. Priya's professional neutrality had developed, by this point, into something that resembled sympathy being actively suppressed for legal reasons. You'll want to speak with our branch manager and potentially file a fraud claim, she said carefully. Do you have access to legal counsel? Margaret thought of the parish bulletin. She thought of the pro bono clinic on Elmhurst Avenue whose flyer she had once pocketed and never called. I'll get it, she said. She took the bus home. She sat in her kitchen for a long time without making tea, without eating, with the letter in her pocket and the image of that wrong signature behind her eyes. The refrigerator hummed. The 7 train passed twice. She called Daniel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His recorded voice, warm and professional. You've reached Drive. Daniel Holloway. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. She did not leave a message. She called again an hour later. This time it rang twice before going to voicemail, which meant he had seen the call and declined it. This was a new piece of information, and Margaret filed it away with the specific, careful stillness of a woman who had learned that panic did not solve problems. She tried a 3rd time in the evening. He answered on the 4th ring. He sounded tired, or he performed the voice of someone tired, and she was no longer entirely sure which it was. Hey, Mom, I'm sorry, it's been a crazy day. What's up? In the background, Margaret heard a voice. Low, female, then silence, as though a door had been closed. I went to the bank today, she said. Oh? His voice remained even. There was a withdrawal from my retirement account. $50,000. A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. In 24 years of raising him, she had become fluent in his pauses the way you become fluent in a language you speak daily. And this pause was not the pause of surprise. It had the texture of something anticipated. Mom, he said, and his voice shifted into something gentler, something careful. Chloe mentioned that she'd been handling some of the financial coordination for the wedding. I thought you knew. I did not know, Margaret said. She said she spoke to you about the POA. That you'd agreed. Daniel. Her voice was not loud. It was not shaking. It was the voice she had used exactly once before, when he was 16 and had lied to her about where he'd been for 4 hours on a Saturday night. Quiet and completely certain. I did not sign that document. I did not authorize any withdrawal. I am telling you this clearly. Another pause. Longer this time. I hear you, he said at last. Let me talk to Chloe. I'm sure there's an explanation. Can we talk about this at dinner this weekend? Chloe is heard whispering in the background. She said quietly. Tell her we're busy. The pause that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Mom, call me tomorrow, Daniel. She hung up. She sat for a long time in the kitchen with the letter on the table in front of her. And she thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what the distance was between those two things. The Medicare Part D notice was still pinned to the corkboard above the counter. She had received it the week before, the cheerful bureaucratic language informing her that she had entered the coverage gap, the part people called the donut hole, and that her out-of-pocket medication costs would increase substantially until she reached catastrophic coverage. Her blood pressure medication, her thyroid medication, the low-dose aspirin she took every morning because her doctor had told her to, and she did what her doctor told her. She did the math in her head the way she had always done the math in her head. In the particular automatic arithmetic of a woman for whom money had always been finite and its management therefore serious. The math was not good. $50,000 gone. Her medications more expensive by a number she did not yet want to add up. And her son, who had been her son for 24 years, on the other end of a phone call where someone was whispering in the background. She unpinned the pro bono clinic flyer from the corkboard. She smoothed it on the table. She did not call that night because it was after 6 and they would be closed. But she folded the flyer carefully and put it in her wallet, in the slot where she usually kept the dry cleaning ticket. She would call in the morning. She told herself this with the same steady certainty with which she had told herself, for 2 decades, that she would be there when Daniel needed her. She was still that woman. Whatever was happening, she was still that woman. The kitchen was very quiet. The carnations she had not yet thrown away, 3 white ones in the small glass vase, had begun to droop at the edges. She left them where they were. The invitation arrived by actual mail, on cardstock that Margaret estimated cost approximately $3 per sheet. Engraved in a font she associated with wedding announcements and funeral programs in equal measure. It requested the pleasure of her company at a private dinner at the Cavendish Club on East 61st Street. Described as a final wedding coordination gathering, hosted by Victoria and Leonard Sterling, Saturday the 29th at 7:30 in the evening. Final wedding coordination. Margaret turned the card over in her hands. The back was blank, cream-colored, smooth as something that had never been touched by a commercial kitchen or a mop handle. She had 3 days. She spent one of them calling the Elder Law Clinic on Elmhurst Avenue, speaking to a paralegal named Yolanda, who had a voice like someone who had heard everything and remained troubled by most of it. Yolanda told her the POA situation was serious, that financial exploitation of older adults was the fastest growing form of elder abuse in New York State, and that Margaret should document everything: letters, bank statements, the original signature comparison, and come in for a consultation that Thursday. Margaret wrote down the appointment in the small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer and set a reminder on her phone. She spent the second day pressing her good dress. It was a navy sheath, bought 5 years ago for Joe's memorial. Mass, knee-length, well-made in the way that inexpensive things are occasionally well-made when you buy them from the right place. She had worn it twice. She pressed it carefully with a damp cloth between the iron and the fabric, the way her mother had shown her. And she hung it on the back of the bedroom door and looked at it for a while. She thought, I am going to this dinner. She thought, I am going as his mother. She thought, whatever they have planned, I will walk in as his mother. On Saturday evening she took the 7 to Times Square and transferred to the Inn, and came out on Lexington and walked 3 blocks in the October dark. Her good coat buttoned to the collar, her navy dress underneath, her sensible shoes clicking on the sidewalk with the particular rhythm of a woman who knew how to move in cities. The Cavendish Club was the kind of place that had no sign outside. You were expected to know where you were going or not be going there at all. A man in a dark suit opened the door before she reached it, because the doors here opened before you reached them. And Margaret walked through into wood-paneled warmth and the smell of old money, which is slightly different from the smell of new money and considerably different from the smell of a queen's apartment in late October. She gave her name. She was escorted to a private dining room on the 2nd floor. The Sterlings were already there. Victoria Sterling, who was 63 and looked 52 in the way that requires significant financial commitment, sat at the head of the table in a deep burgundy jacket and a strand of pearls that Margaret suspected were not decorative. Leonard Sterling, quieter, more watchful, sat to Victoria's left. Chloe was there, in green, a color that suited her in the infuriating way that everything seemed to suit women like Chloe. Her dark hair swept up, her expression arranged into something that resembled welcome. And Daniel, seated to Chloe's right, his posture slightly stiff in the way it got when he was uncomfortable, his eyes finding Margaret's as she came through the door and then sliding away. Which was the worst thing, not the slide itself but its quickness, how fast he looked away. There were 4 other couples Margaret did not recognize, all in the general vicinity of the Sterling's social stratum. Victoria stood when Margaret entered, with the particular controlled warmth of a woman for whom hospitality is a performance rather than an instinct. "Margaret, how wonderful! We were so hoping you'd come." She gestured to a seat, not the seat beside Daniel, Margaret noted, but one further down, near the corner. "You look," a pause, fractional, artistically timed. "Well, very comfortable." Margaret sat where she was placed. She said thank you because she had been raised to say thank you. The dinner began. Courses arrived with the quiet choreography of a kitchen that had been doing this for 60 years. Margaret ate carefully and spoke when spoken to, which, it turned out, was not frequently. The conversations around her moved in the dialect of people who had known each other for decades. Full of references she did not have, names she didn't recognize, a shared vocabulary of vacation places and board memberships and whose children were doing what at which institution. She watched Daniel. He ate without appetite. He listened more than he spoke. Chloe's hand rested on his arm at intervals with the specific possessive weight of someone establishing ownership in front of witnesses. It was during the second course that Victoria introduced Margaret to the couple to her left. "This is Daniel's." Victoria paused again. The same fractional pause, the same performance of searching for the right word. "His nanny, from when he was small. Margaret, she's been so devoted, all these years." The couple smiled, the polite smiles of people who have been told a fact about another person and are processing whether it requires any further engagement. Margaret looked at Victoria. She did not say I am his mother. Not yet. She said, "Daniel was 7 when I met him. He's 31 now. I've known him for 24 years. Victoria smiled. "Isn't that lovely? Loyalty like that is so rare in service relationships." Across the table, Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at his plate. Margaret set her fork down across her plate with the precision of someone who has decided something. "I am his mother," she said. Clear, not loud. The room's ambient murmur did not stop, because she had not said it with the kind of volume that stops rooms. But the 4 people near enough to hear it heard it clearly. "Legally and in every other sense. His father adopted him and I raised him. That is what I am." Victoria's smile remained perfectly in place, because hers was the kind of smile that had been trained to remain in place. "Of course," she said warmly. "We all think of you that way." Then Chloe reached across the table for the water pitcher, and her arm moved with the loose grace of someone not paying attention. "And the half-full glass of red wine to Margaret's left, a Bordeaux," the sommelier had said, from a particular year that meant something to people who tracked these things. Tipped and fell and emptied itself in a dark red wave across the front of Margaret's navy dress. The table gasped with the collective intake of people witnessing an accident. Chloe's hand went to her mouth. "Oh God," she said. "I'm so sorry, Margaret, I wasn't." "It's fine," Margaret said. She pressed her napkin to the dress. The stain was immediate and total, the way red wine stains always are on navy, the way some things cannot be taken back. "Can we get some?" Chloe signaled to the waiter, her expression arranged into distress. But her eyes, in the moment before the expression settled, were briefly unguarded, and what Margaret saw in them in that fraction of a second was not distress. It was satisfaction. Margaret pressed the white linen napkin against the ruined dress. And she looked at Chloe with the specific steady attention of a woman who has now seen what she came here to see. Daniel reached across from his seat. "Mom, I'm all right," she said. She was all right. She was more all right than she had been when she walked in, because she no longer had any uncertainty about what this was. The not knowing had been the worst part. The knowing, even when the thing known was terrible, was solid ground beneath her feet. She could stand on it. She stayed until the end of the dinner. She ate what remained of her meal. She said goodnight to the Sterlings with the courtesy she had been raised to maintain and that no one could take from her because it lived in her bones. On the train home, the 4 Express from Grand Central, she sat with her ruined dress under her coat and her hands in her lap and the particular stillness of a woman who is deciding something large. The room had gone quiet when she said it. She had felt it. "I am his mother." She would keep saying it until there was no room left in anyone's mind for any other word. She found it on the kitchen table. She had been in the building's laundry room in the basement, trying with cold water and dish soap to save the Navy dress, knowing already that it could not be saved, doing it anyway because she could not yet allow herself to stop moving, and when she came back upstairs the apartment door was unlocked. She was certain she had locked it. She was the kind of person who locked her door. She had been locking that door for 22 years. Inside, on the kitchen table, next to the carnations she still hadn't thrown away, was a manila envelope. Not slipped under the door. Not left on the doormat. On the table, which meant someone had a key. She stood in the doorway for a moment without going in, her wet dress bundled under her arm. The hallway light from behind her throwing her shadow across the linoleum. Then she stepped in and closed the door and sat down at the table and opened the envelope. It was a reverse mortgage application. 7 pages, clean copies, professionally printed. It was pre-filled. Her name, her address, the Queen's apartment, which she owned outright, which she had paid off 4 years ago. With the last of a second mortgage she had taken out to cover Daniel's second year of medical school when his financial aid was restructured. The apartment was worth, by current Queen's market estimates, somewhere between $300,000 and $340,000. The application was pre-filled in every field. Her name, her social security number, her date of birth, her property information, accurate to the parcel identification number that she had never once memorized and therefore could not have provided from memory. At the bottom of the final page, a signature line, blank, waiting. A sticky note was affixed to the first page in handwriting she recognized as precise and looping for your security and Daniel's future. Let's discuss timing. C.S. Margaret set the application on the table. She understood now, the whole shape of it. The POA that extracted her retirement savings. The dinner at the Cavendish Club. The public humiliation. The social erasure his nanny, from when he was small, the wine on her dress. These were not random cruelties. They were steps, each one designed to isolate her, to diminish her, to reduce her in Daniel's perception and in her own. And now this a reverse mortgage. Her apartment, her only remaining asset of substance, leveraged until the equity was gone, the payments flowing out until she could no longer meet them. At which point the bank foreclosed and she had nothing. And a woman with nothing, a woman who lived where? In what? Was a woman who could be declared financially unstable, cognitively suspect, unable to care for herself. A burden, a problem, an obstacle to be managed through the legal mechanisms that existed for exactly this kind of thing. She was 64 years old and she had worked for 40 years and they were going to take her apartment and call it security. The refrigerator hummed. Margaret looked at the application for a long time. Outside, the 7 train passed, its distant clatter a sound she had spent 22 years not hearing. She heard it now. She looked at the photo on the windowsill. Joe, in the last good summer, outside the house in Rockaway they had rented for a week, his arm around a 20-year-old Daniel, who was pretending to object to the photograph but was smiling anyway. Joe had been a big man, wide in the shoulders, with a laugh that filled rooms and a gentleness he had never once felt the need to disguise. She had loved him the way you love something you didn't expect to find. completely and without preparation. He had been gone 11 years and she still talked to the photo sometimes. Not every day. On the days it was warranted. The pen was there, on the table. Someone had left it there too. A deliberate placement, the envelope, the application, the pen. Everything she needed to sign herself out of her own life. She picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line. Her hand was not shaking. She observed this with a clinical detachment that surprised her slightly. Her hands had not shaken during the dinner, either, not when the wine hit her dress, not when Victoria said his nanny. She had her mother's hands, wide-palmed and scarred from the grill, and they did not shake easily. She was about to sign. She was about to sign because she was tired, because she was 64 and her medication was getting more expensive. And her retirement savings were gone, and the man she had raised for 24 years had looked away when she walked through the door. And it is possible, at 64, after a sufficient accumulation of certain kinds of evidence, to believe that you are what they say you are. A shadow, a ghost haunting someone else's future. She was about to sign, and she pulled open the kitchen drawer to move it out of the way, and there it was. A drawing, crayon on construction paper, sun faded and soft at the edges from years of handling. A child's drawing a house with 4 windows and a tree with a round top and, standing in front of the house, 2 figures. The taller one had long hair, which was how an 8-year-old Daniel had understood her, long dark hair, and a smile that was 3/4 of her face. The smaller one stood very close to the taller one, their arms touching. At the bottom, in the crooked capital letters of a child learning to print, "My Mom and Me." She had kept this drawing for 23 years. She set the pen down. She sat back in her chair and she breathed. She looked at the drawing and she thought, "I have not broken it yet." The promise she had made in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic. And the particular grief of a boy who had already been left once and was terrified of being left again. "Don't leave me like my real mom did." And she had taken his 14-year-old hand. And she had said never, and she had meant it, and she had kept meaning it for 17 years through everything that meaning it required. She thought, "They are not taking this from me. Not the apartment. Not my son. Not this." She put the reverse mortgage application back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the kitchen drawer, under the drawing. She made tea. She stood at the window while it steeped and looked out at the elevated tracks and the gray-orange Queens sky and the lit windows of the apartments across the way. All those lit windows, all those people in their lit kitchens on a Saturday night. She thought about what she had and what she needed and what she was going to do. She had the drawing. She had Joe's voice in her memory, his wide laugh, his specific certainty that she was the person for this particular job. She had the paralegal's appointment on Thursday. And she had, somewhere in this apartment, in a tin box on the shelf in the hall closet behind the winter blankets, a document she had not thought about in years. A life insurance policy, Joe's, converted to whole life when Daniel started high school. The paperwork signed and witnessed and dated, with her name as sole beneficiary. She had paid the premiums for 11 years, small amounts, automatic withdrawals. Something she had set up and then filed and not thought about because the thinking about it was not something she allowed herself to do often. The Sterlings did not know about it. She was sure of that, because there was no way to know about it unless you were Margaret Holloway. And they had clearly decided that Margaret Holloway was a woman whose life they had already fully mapped. They had not fully mapped her. She drank her tea in the quiet kitchen, the drawing on the table in front of her, the ruined dress somewhere in the bathroom. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. "I haven't broken it yet, Joe," she said. She said it to the photo on the windowsill, to the room, to the air. That had held her for 22 years in this apartment that was hers and was going to remain hers. Then she opened her notebook and she began to write down everything she knew. Friends, what a story we have unfolding. Margaret has spent a lifetime building something real, her son, her home, her dignity, with nothing but hard work and a love that never asked to be repaid. And now, piece by piece, the people around her are trying to dismantle all of it. The forged signature, the stolen retirement savings, the public humiliation in that dining room. And now, a reverse mortgage application left on her kitchen table like an eviction notice for her own life. But here's what the Sterlings have gotten wrong. They looked at Margaret Holloway and they saw a woman with nothing left to fight with. They didn't see the drawing in the kitchen drawer. They didn't see what's in that tin box on the closet shelf. And they don't yet know what Margaret is about to find out about Chloe. Stay with us, friends. The second half of this story is where everything changes. 20 years ago, a hospital room on the 4th floor of Queens General had smelled of antiseptic and old floor wax and the specific grief of late November. When the days go dark early and the dark has weight. Joe had been in that room for 11 days. The tumor was in his brainstem, inoperable, discovered 6 weeks after he first mentioned the headaches. 6 weeks from I've been getting these headaches to a hospital bed on the 4th floor. Which was the speed at which certain lives pivoted. Without warning, without the courtesy of preparation. Daniel had been 14. He had sat in the orange plastic chair beside the bed every day after school, his backpack still on his back. Sometimes, as though staying only briefly, as though not committing to the length of the visit. Margaret had understood this. She had sat on the other side. On the 9th day, Joe had a clear hour in the afternoon, the morphine dialed back slightly. His eyes focused and present in a way that had become precious for its rarity. He had looked at Daniel for a long time. Then he had looked at Margaret. He said, "You've got him." Not a question, a transfer, a handing over of something he had carried that now needed other hands. She had said, "I've got him." On the 11th day he was gone. That night, at 2 in the morning, Daniel had come into the kitchen, where Margaret was sitting with cold coffee and the insurance paperwork she couldn't stop reading because stopping meant she had to think about something else. He had sat across from her and he had not said anything for a long time. Then he had said, in the voice of a boy trying very hard to be older than he was, "Don't leave me like my real mom did." His birth mother had walked away when he was 6. A choice Margaret had never fully understood and had never once criticized to Daniel's face, because he would have to make his own peace with it in his own time. And her job was not to shape his grief but to make sure he survived it. Never, Margaret had said, "You are my son." She had meant it the way you mean things at 2 in the morning when the person you love has just died and the child across from you is the remaining reason. Completely, without reservation, without a clear understanding of every cost. She had kept that promise through his high school years, his undergraduate years, his medical school years, through every crisis and every ordinary Tuesday and every moment when keeping it was difficult. She was still keeping it. In the hall closet, behind the winter blankets, the tin box was where she had always kept it. Green, with a small dent on one side from the time she'd moved it off a high shelf too quickly. Inside Joe's whole life policy, renewed annually, the premiums automatic and small and, until this week, unremarkable. She lifted it out and opened it and unfolded the papers inside. The policy was intact. The premiums had been paid to current. The beneficiary was Margaret Lorraine Holloway. The cash value, accumulated over 11 years of whole life payments, was listed in the most recent statement at $43,000. Not 50, but real. And because it was a whole life policy, because it was structured. The way it was structured, it could not be touched by a power of attorney covering financial accounts. It was an insurance product, not a bank account. It was hers in a way the 401k had not been adequately hers. She put the policy in the inner pocket of her winter coat, which she hung back in the closet. She thought about the paralegal appointment. She thought about the elder law clinic and Yolanda's voice and the word documentation. She had that now, the POA, the withdrawal notice, the reverse mortgage application. The original letter from the bank, her own signature to compare against the forged one. She thought about the Ring camera. She had installed it at the front door 3 years ago after the super mentioned there'd been package thefts in the building. She had forgotten about it in the particular way you forget about things that work quietly in the background. It stored footage to the cloud. 30 days rolling, automatically. She did not yet know what was on it. She called her neighbor Marcus, who was 27 and worked in IT and occasionally helped her with the building's Wi-Fi when the super was unavailable. She asked him if he could help her look at the camera history. "Sure, Mrs. H," he said. "I can come by tomorrow afternoon." "Thank you," she said. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the phone. She was not a woman who had been trained for any of this. She was a woman who had grilled eggs and made brisket and paid bills on time and raised a son and loved a husband and outlived him. These were her qualifications. She had read somewhere, in a magazine in a waiting room a long time ago, that the definition of a witness was someone who was present and paid attention. She thought about that now. She had been present for 24 years. She had paid attention. She was going to be a very effective witness. Marcus came at 2 o'clock on Sunday with his laptop and the slightly embarrassed helpfulness of a young person assisting an older neighbor with technology. The particular blend of competence and patience that Margaret had always appreciated in him. He sat up at the kitchen table with his coffee and pulled the Ring account up in under 4 minutes. "How far back do you want to go?" he asked. "October," she said. "Start at the first." The footage was time-stamped and searchable. They went through it in 30-minute segments. Margaret standing behind Marcus with her reading glasses on, watching the fish-eye view of her front hallway door. The slightly distorted corridor, the edge of the elevator bank. It took 40 minutes to find what she was looking for, and when she found it she was not entirely surprised, because surprise requires the absence of a suspicion you've already been carrying. And she had been carrying this particular suspicion since the October dinner, since the moment she had seen something in Chloe's eyes when the wine hit her dress. October 3rd, 2:17 in the afternoon. A Tuesday, which was one of Daniel's regular double-shift days at the Margaret knew his schedule, had always known his schedule, in the background way that mothers carry the information of their children's lives. Chloe appeared in the corridor at 2:17, wearing a camel coat and carrying a large tote bag, her dark hair loose. She was not alone. The man with her was tall, fair-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, in a jacket Margaret did not recognize. Chloe had a key. Margaret watched her use it, watched the door swing open with the casual ease of someone who had used this key before. The man followed her inside. The door closed. At 4:51 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 34 minutes later, the door opened again. The man left first, then Chloe, adjusting the strap of her tote bag. At the door, she stopped and looked directly at the Ring camera for a moment. Not a suspicious look, not a caught look, a look of mild, contemptuous awareness, the look of someone who had noticed the camera and assessed it as irrelevant. She had been wrong about that. "You want me to export this?" Marcus asked. His voice was neutral in the careful way of someone choosing not to ask what he was looking at. "Yes, please. Everything from October 1st through today. To my email." "Done." He typed for a moment. "And I'd back it up to a USB if I were you, Mrs. H. Just in case." She had a USB drive in the kitchen drawer. He transferred it, capped it, handed it to her. She put it in the same inner coat pocket with Joe's insurance policy. "Marcus," she said. "Thank you. Anytime." He looked at her for a moment, the way young people sometimes looked at her, not with pity but with something that resembled the recognition of capability. "You good?" "I'm good," she said. She was at the elder law clinic on Thursday at 10 o'clock. Yolanda was there, and the supervising attorney, a compact woman in her 50s named Christine Vargas, who had close-cropped gray hair and a manner of speaking that reminded Margaret of the best doctors she had known, clear, unhurried, without condescension. Margaret laid everything on the table: the POA document, the withdrawal notice, the reverse mortgage application, the Ring footage on the USB drive, her original account statements showing her signature for comparison against the POA forgery, the letter from the bank, the sticky note with Chloe's initials. Christine Vargas reviewed each item without hurry. When she reached the Ring footage, she watched the relevant segment twice. How long has this woman had access to your apartment? She asked. That's the only instance I've found, Margaret said. She could have made a copy of the key without my knowledge at some point during a visit. The POA has been reviewed by our forensic document specialist. We'd want an official comparison, but the preliminary read is consistent with forgery. Christine set the papers in a neat stack. What you have here is substantial, Margaret. We're looking at financial elder abuse, the fraudulent POA, the unauthorized withdrawal, and the reverse mortgage as attempted continuation of the pattern. The video gives us context for the relationship and calls into question the character of the primary actor. What does she want? Margaret asked, the question she had been building toward. Christine looked at her steadily. In cases structured like this, the goal is typically asset transfer combined with social isolation. Remove the financial resources, undermine the family relationship, establish a narrative of cognitive or financial incompetence. Then leverage that narrative for legal separation, guardianship challenges, separation from family decision-making. If the subject of the exploitation has no assets and no functional family relationship, she has no means of resistance. The subject of the exploitation. Margaret had known this, in her bones, since the kitchen table. Hearing it spoken by a woman who had spent 20 years studying. These patterns had the effect of making it real in a new way, not more frightening, but clearer. The map had edges now. She could see the whole terrain. What do we do? She said. Christine Vargas opened a file and uncapped her pen. We build a case, she said. And then we find the right moment to present it. Margaret thought about the engagement party. She had received her invitation 3 days ago, embossed cardstock again. The Cavendish Club again, November 19th. A grand celebration for 250 guests. The tribute video they had announced would play on the ballroom screens, compiled by the wedding coordinator. A professional production celebrating Daniel and Chloe's journey together. She thought about 250 people in a ballroom screen. She thought about the footage on the USB drive in her coat pocket. She thought about Chloe's eyes looking at the Ring camera. That assessment, that small, contemptuous certainty that it didn't matter. I think I know the moment, Margaret said. The Cavendish Club on a Saturday evening in November was everything that the Cavendish Club was designed to be. Flowers in the entrance hall that were taller than Margaret, white and sculptural. The kind of arrangement that did not suggest celebration so much as power. Ballets at the curb. Guests in the particular formal wear of people for whom formal occasions are not unusual. Moving through the lobby with the unhurried confidence of people who have always been expected and always will be. Margaret arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes after the official start time, which Christine Vargas had recommended. Not so late as to be conspicuous. Late enough to let the room fill. She wore the black dress she had bought that week, not expensive. Not deliberately modest either, just clean and well-fitted, because she was 64 years old and she was done apologizing for the shape she occupied in the world. She had her coat over her arm and the USB drive in her bag and a conversation she had arranged 3 days ago. The wedding coordinator's name was Jeff Halliday, and she had reached him through the contact information on the Cavendish Club's vendor list, which was a matter of public record, and she had called him on a Wednesday morning and told him, clearly and briefly, that she had video material that needed to be included in the evening's tribute programming, and that she had the right as Daniel's legal parent to request this inclusion. Jeff Halliday was a man who handled logistics for a living and had no stake in the content he projected, and had agreed with the professional neutrality of someone who had encountered stranger requests. She had handed him the USB drive at 7 that evening, at the venue's back entrance, and had explained exactly what she wanted him to play and at precisely what moment in the program. Now she was inside. Daniel found her in the first 20 minutes, weaving through the cocktail crowd, with the expression of a man who is managing several things simultaneously and has not been sleeping well. He looked genuinely relieved to see her, which was its own complicated thing to feel. "Mom," he touched her shoulder. "I didn't know you were coming." "I was invited," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. I know. I meant I wasn't sure if you'd want to. He paused. Are you okay? After the dinner, and I've been trying to call. We'll talk tonight, she said. After. He looked at her for a moment with the specific attention he had given her since he was old enough to recognize that. She said more in few words than most people said in paragraphs. Then Chloe appeared at his elbow, radiant in ivory, a champagne flute in each hand, and Margaret watched the slight shift in Daniel's posture, the small, involuntary adjustment of a person who is in a position they have not fully examined. Margaret. Chloe's smile was warm and complete and showed every tooth. I'm so glad you came. Chloe, Margaret said. She accepted the champagne flute that was extended to her and held it without drinking. The evening moved through its stages. Cocktails became a seated dinner, which became speeches, which became the moment when the lights dimmed and the wedding coordinator's voice came from the front of the room. Smooth and practiced, and now, we invite you to watch a tribute to Daniel and Chloe, the journey that brought them to tonight. The screens on 3 walls of the ballroom came alive. For 45 seconds, it was exactly what 250 guests expected: photographs, soft music. Daniel at various ages, Chloe at various ages, the two of them together. A professionally edited sequence that communicated love and trajectory and a future carefully planned. Then the footage changed. What came next was not accompanied by music. It was time-stamped, grainy at the edges in the way that door cameras are grainy, the fisheye lens slightly distorting the proportions of the corridor. It was October 3rd, at 2:17 in the afternoon. It was Chloe in a camel coat with a man who was not Daniel. It was a key in a door that was not Chloe's door. It was 2 hours and 34 minutes collapsed into 40 seconds of footage that no one in the room could misread. The room did not gasp. It went silent, which is different. Silence is the sound of 250 people understanding something simultaneously. Chloe stood from her seat. The color had left her face in the specific way that has nothing to do with pallor and everything to do with exposure. The look of a person who has built a structure and is watching it fall. She started. That's October 3rd, Margaret said from her seat, her voice carrying in the silence the way voices carry in silence. A Tuesday, one of Daniel's double-shift days. A second clip was now running on the screens. Christine Vargas had helped Margaret prepare the sequence carefully. A document scanned the POA, Margaret's signature as it appeared on 20 years of signed checks, beside the signature on the POA. Side by side, the differences were legible even from the back of the room, to anyone who looked. Then the bank withdrawal notice, $50,000. Then the reverse mortgage application with the sticky note, for your security and Daniel's future. C.S. Then the screens went dark. Victoria Sterling had not moved. She was sitting very still, the way certain people go still when they are recalibrating, and Margaret could see in her profile the rapid, expert assessment of a woman who has managed crises before and is deciding which tools to reach for. Leonard had his hand on the table. Chloe was standing, her champagne still in her hand, her ivory dress very bright in the room's returned light. Daniel was looking at Margaret. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the orange plastic chair by Joe's hospital bed, with the full weight of himself. The version of himself that didn't manage or adjust or perform. The version that was just her son. He looked at his fiancée. He looked at the dark screen. He looked back at his mother. She met his eyes and she did not say anything, because this was the part that was his, the part she could not do for him. She had given him the truth. What he did with it was the choice he had to make himself, at 31, as his own person. She had always known this moment would come in some form, the moment when she had done everything she could do and the rest was his. Daniel stood up. He was tall in the room, taller than she remembered him being sometimes. And he moved with the steady deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is no longer uncertain about it. He said, "Chloe." She turned to him. Something in her eyes shifted, the professional warmth dissolving, the real face briefly visible underneath, the one that had looked at the ring camera and decided it didn't matter. I need you to explain the power of attorney, he said. His voice was a doctor's voice, not cold, but factual. The voice for delivering information that cannot be softened by delivery. Daniel, my mother did not sign that document. The comparison is right there. He did not gesture at the screen. He didn't need to. The room was still holding all of it. I need you to explain it to me. What followed in the next 4 minutes was not, in the end, a dramatic confrontation in the way that public confrontations are supposed to be. It was quieter than that. Chloe attempted 2 different frameworks. It was a misunderstanding. Then it was standard practice in these arrangements. And each framework collapsed under the specific weight of what was on the screen. And eventually the room had its answer, not from any decisive pronouncement, but from the simple fact of a story that could no longer hold its shape. Victoria began to speak from the far end of the table. Daniel turned and said, "Not now," in a tone that closed the door on that conversation with a finality that surprised even Margaret. Then he walked the length of the room to where she was sitting. "Mom," he said. He sat beside her. He put his hand over hers on the table, her scarred, wide-palmed hand, and he held it in both of his, and he did not say anything else for a moment because he was her son. And he knew that some things didn't need to be said to be understood. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "I should have." "You didn't know," she said. "I should have asked. I should have." "Daniel." She turned her hand over and held his. "You're here now." He nodded. His jaw was tight. He would have more to process than one evening could contain, and she knew that, and she was prepared to give him every day it took. In the end, the truth was the only scalpel sharp enough to save her son's life. And it had done its work cleanly. The lease was a standard New York commercial lease, 12 pages, single-spaced, with the particular density of a legal document that has been refined over decades to account for every conceivable dispute between landlords and tenants in one of the world's most litigated real estate markets. Margaret read it twice, which was her habit with documents now, and then she signed it. Her signature was her own. The M that opened too wide. The H that compressed at the top. Her name, in her hand, belonging to her. Margaret's kitchen opened on a Saturday in the first week of March, in a storefront on a quiet block of Astoria that had been a dry cleaner for 20 years. And then a cell phone shop for 3, and then empty for 8 months before Margaret's attorney found the listing. The space was small, 380 square feet of kitchen and counter and 4 small tables, but the light came in well in the morning from the east-facing windows, and the ventilation was adequate. And the rent was manageable against the projection her accountant had built from the whole life policy cash value. And the returned 401k funds, recovered in full after the investigation the elder law clinic filed in November, had moved through the civil system with the particular speed that well-documented financial fraud cases sometimes achieved when the opposing party's attorneys advised their client that a courtroom would not serve them. Chloe had not fought it. Margaret suspected that fighting it had been one option set against several others, and that Victoria Sterling, for all her practiced management of situations, had made a practical assessment. The money was returned. The POA was voided. The legal proceedings were resolved without a trial. The engagement had been called off by Daniel on the drive home from the Cavendish Club, in a conversation he had described to Margaret only in fragments. Because some conversations belong entirely to the people who have them, and she had not pushed. She knew what she needed to know, that her son had driven home from that room, clear-eyed, and had called Chloe from the parking garage and had spoken for 20 minutes and had come upstairs to Margaret's apartment afterward, and sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning drinking tea and not saying much, which was what he needed and what she gave him. The Queen's apartment she had sold in February. Not because she had to. The reverse mortgage had never been signed, had never had any legal standing, but because the market was right. And because she was ready to stop living inside the walls of the life she had built around surviving and start living inside something she had built around being alive. The sale had given her the capital to sign the Astoria lease and buy the commercial equipment and paint the walls. The specific shade of yellow she had been picturing for longer than she could account for, a warm egg yolk yellow, The color of a kitchen that means it. On the morning of the opening, she came in at 5. She had always come in at 5. For 40 years, 5 o'clock had been the hour her body understood as the start of things. She had come in at 5 to the diner on Northern Boulevard and prepped the grill and started the coffee and been there when the first customer of the morning pushed through the door. With the specific gratitude of a person who needs coffee before they are ready to be a person. She had done this for so many years that 5 o'clock and the smell of a commercial kitchen and the particular silence of a city that hadn't fully woken up, yet were woven together in her body into something that felt like purpose. She made the first batch of biscuits at 5:15. She made a honey cake and a sour cream coffee cake and 3 dozen rugelach, the recipe she had gotten from a woman named Esther Morgenstern, who had worked the register at the diner for 11 years and had given Margaret the recipe as a retirement gift, handwritten on a 3x5 card that Margaret had laminated and hung in the first kitchen she had ever called her own. At 7:30, Daniel arrived. He had taken a position at a community health clinic in Woodside in December, a 15-minute drive from Astoria. A decision that had not been explained to her in any elaborate way. He had called one evening and said he'd taken the job and that he started on the 2nd. And that he thought it was the right thing, and she had said she agreed, and that had been the conversation. He was working with an underserved population, mostly immigrant families and elderly patients. People who fell through the gaps of a healthcare system that was structured around everything except the people who needed it most. He was good at it. She had always known he would be good at it. He came in through the back, the way she had given him the key for. And he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the yellow walls and the full sheet pans cooling on the racks and his mother in her apron at the counter. And he said, "It smells exactly like I hoped it would." "Biscuits are on the counter," she said. He sat at the counter and ate a biscuit and looked at the room while she finished the rugelach, and they talked the way they had talked since November without the careful management of before. Without the half-second delays in his responses, without the screen angled away. They talked the way she and Joe had talked directly, about real things. With the particular ease of people who have been through something together and have come out still standing. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "No," she said. Then, a little. "The rugelach alone will bring people back," he said. "Esther taught me." "I know. You've told me. Then you know it's true." He smiled. Her boy's smile. The real one. The one that arrived without preparation. She had missed it more than she had allowed herself to count. The first customers came at 8. A couple from the building on the corner, drawn by the smell or the yellow walls. Or simply the presence of a new thing on a block that had been without one for a while. Then 3 more, a woman with a stroller, 2 men in construction jackets who ordered coffee and biscuits and were back the next morning and the morning after that. By 10 o'clock, all 4 tables were occupied and the coffee cake was gone and Margaret was already running the numbers in her head for the next morning's prep. She thought, standing at the counter with a spatula in her hand and the morning light coming in strong from the east-facing windows, this is what it feels like. Not the gratitude of surviving. Not the relief of not having lost. Something else. Something she had been approaching for a long time without knowing it. The particular satisfaction of having built something that was entirely, specifically, unmistakably hers. At 64, she had learned something she wished she had known earlier and was glad she knew now, that being a mother is not about blood. It is about the quality of attention you give to a life that is not yours and the consistency with which you give it, in the ordinary days and in the terrible ones, when the lights go out. And there is no audience and no reward except the fact of having stayed. She had stayed. She had stayed for 24 years, and in the end she had not stayed as a sacrifice. She had stayed because Daniel was her son and because she had promised, and because the promise, kept, had made her someone she was proud to be. She had signed her name on the lease on a cold Wednesday in February, and it had felt like it belonged to her. It had always belonged to her. She just hadn't had a room of her own, until now, to sign it in. Friends, how did you find today's story? Margaret Holloway walked into this story with nothing but love, a scarred pair of hands, and a promise she had made in a hospital room 20 years ago. And she walked out of it not because she was rescued, not because anyone swooped in to make it right, but because she paid attention. Because she remembered who she was when they told her she was nobody. Because she kept a child's drawing in a kitchen drawer and it stopped her hand at the right moment. That's the thing about this story that stays with me. Margaret was stripped of her money, her dignity, her sense of her own son. She sat in a dark kitchen with a pen in her hand and a reverse mortgage application in front of her, and she almost signed. She almost believed what they needed her to believe, that she was a burden, a ghost, a woman whose useful years were behind her. And then she opened a drawer. There is something in that image that I think speaks to all of us, no matter our age. The thing that saves us is rarely the dramatic gesture. It's the drawing in the drawer. The promise we made so long ago we almost forgot we were still keeping it. The voice of someone we loved who told us, "You've got this." Margaret was 64 years old. She had no legal team on retainer, no family connections, no resources that looked impressive from the outside. What she had was clarity, patience, and the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The courage of a woman who gets up at 5 in the morning and does what needs to be done. I hope this story reminded you of something you've got in your own drawer. Some promise you're still keeping. Some version of yourself that is more capable than anyone around you has bothered to notice. And I hope you'll subscribe and hit that like button, because the stories we tell here are for people like Margaret. And for everyone who has ever been told they were less than they knew themselves to be. Thank you for being here, friends. This community means everything.